All right. Hello and welcome, everybody, to cPDH.Guides official partner podcast. This is Adam Beach Bod God 69 signing in, along with my good friend Ben, South Lakes Vibes. Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, Adam. Very pleased to be here. Looking forward to a conversation about the PDH meta.
Yes, me as well. It's going to be a great time. I hope that your Friday is treating you well. Also, any fun plans for the weekend coming up? It's Easter weekend. Good Friday today.
Easter weekend. I'm off to see the family. I am in a sort of constant mission to try and get my three younger brothers to play PDH with me, which has been met with a very lukewarm response. But they just don't get it. They just don't get it yet. They don't get the grind. So we will try and sneak some games in. Otherwise, just seeing relatives and chilling out. What's your plan, friend?
Oh my gosh, 4 younger brothers. So
Three. I am one of
three younger brothers. Right. That's incredible. Well, you'll guide them through it. I mean, just use that big brother energy. Just make it happen.
Masculinely shove my way into their bedrooms.
Right. Just you will play. Yeah. Well, good. Yeah, I don't have really any plans. I mean, this year we've I don't know if you can hear my dog scurrying about behind me, but we've got just a big kind of traditional American style Easter where it's just Thanksgiving with ham, and we just get together, eat and be lethargic, right, and just kind of hang out. So that's what we're gonna do. But it'll be fun. It'll be a good time to see everybody. And
sick, dude.
Yeah. Sounds like I will be.
Awesome. Yeah. So should we do a bit of brief background on the both of us and how we ended up playing this format?
Yeah, why don't you give us a go? Go for it.
Okay, sure. I'll start. So I started playing Magic probably, I can't be more than 3.5 years ago or something. I think my younger brother brought along some standard decks he's bought for a family holiday, and I thought it was cool. I didn't really get it. I got back home. I played a bit of Magic Arena, which everyone at the time told me was terrible. I thought was pretty cool. I think now that I've played a lot more Magic, I sort of see what they mean. But I built a lot of terrible EDH decks. Just used to pick the worst commander or the least built commander I could find, and tried to fashion something out of it. Never had any win condition. Just tried to draw a lot of cards. It seems to be the rationale. And then,
unless you're one of those, okay.
Yeah. And about a year and a half ago, probably at this point, maybe slightly less than that, I decided I'd like to give Pauper EDH a go. And I realized there was an actual scene, and I just got hooked. It's an amazing community, a lot of diverse viewpoints, a lot of diverse spaces to hang out in, and just a very, very accessible competitive format with really interesting commanders, very interesting strategies. And yeah, this is how I spend a lot of my spare time now, either talking about or brewing decks or playing in the cPDH format. How about you, Adam?
Yeah, it's an awesome story. It's actually very similar. So I've been playing, since I was about 12. So I mean, I'm looking at the way back, probably when Odyssey came out, and just off and on playing Magic. My gateway drug into. Well, my gateway drug was Pokemon, the card game. Believe it or not, I was a gym leader for a little while. I know, right? It was fun. It was a good time. But Magic came out, and it was just like, wow, this is interesting. The older kids are playing this. I want to play this now, and I got hooked. I mean, it's just the best game ever made. And but eventually, it's that point where you've made everything, and it's just kind of stale. And then EDH, kind of Commander came out, and then I was playing that. Pre-DH is what we call it now. The kids call it now, and. I eventually got to that power creep of just dull, everything is just a coin flip at some point. So I started going online, looking at Pauper. I'm older, I got a mortgage now, what's accessible to me. And Pauper Commander showed up, and I saw these it was YouTube. It was Clay, our very own Clay, and then also I think Ryan on the Common Connoisseur. They were doing the tryhards thing for a while, and eventually I found their Discord, met Alcadron, Dave, who introduced me to the format, and then I too was hooked. It's never stale. It's the format that's so accessible and never stale. It's so interesting. The multiplayer dynamics and strategies, just it never gets old. Never gets old. And then I, of course, met you online. I consider you one of my best friends now, if you didn't know that. It's just truly where I spend a lot of my time now is on Discord with you guys. So it's a good time. Very good time.
Thanks, man. Likewise. I think it's quite surprising, I think, when you come into sort of any space and find out how fleshed out it is, and how many different perspectives they are, all the different lore, like the lore between people's relationships, their backgrounds, how different decks came into being. Kind of feels like a lot of the established decks have long stories behind them with different pilots, different brews, different tweaks that have happened along the way. And it really makes you feel like you're part of a consistent process. I feel like we're part of the process of building the story of the format in a very real way that makes it very addictive and makes every one of these conversations somehow so interesting, because there seems to be a weight behind the things we're talking about to some extent. It might actually change someone's mind and the deck they bring to a tournament and the attention it gets or lack of attention it gets thereafter. So I would say that if you are a newer player to Magic, this is an interesting space to be, because the slightly smaller player pool means that if you play well and you do your best to be very disruptive, you can make decks that people might actually be interested in and might actually be disruptive.
Yeah. Well, and let's just kind of add some context. If you've never played Pauper Commander, it's very accessible, like Ben and I have been saying. I mean, so what it is, it's regular Commander Magic, the most popular format, but with the caveat of you have 30 life instead of 40, 16 Commander damage instead of 21. All the cards that you play with in the 99 or 98, depending, are going to be common printed or Pauper legal cards. But really, the only illegal cards, so to speak, are Rhystic Study and Mystic Remora are the two banned cards. But it's all commons. And here's the fun part. Any uncommon creature does not have to be legendary, but any uncommon creature can be that commander, which really opens up that play field, or the possibilities of what you can make and brew, which, like Ben and I have been saying, have been so much fun to talk about and brew up.
I think that's a beautiful description. I think one of the nice things about this format is that you see a lot of cards get played that just don't have a home literally anywhere else. All the stuff that you can pull open in packs goes from being chaff that you move through to get through to the rares and mythic rares into actually interesting combo pieces, aggro pieces, tempo pieces, control pieces, whatever. Stuff that can make and break certain decks, stuff that's worth tutoring for, opens up new tutoring opportunities. It just lets you extract a lot more value from the packs you open, and it lets you look forward to a lot more of the catalog that Magic releases. And I think
oh my gosh,
something kind of beautiful about enjoying cards that are supposed to be simpler in nature and finding unusual things to do with them.
Not to mention the price point. I mean, the fact is that it's really like the price. I mean, you can make a very competitive deck for $50.
Easy.
Really, really easily. And when I open booster packs now, a lot of people are like, oh man, it's like scratch offs for nerds, right? Like, let me get, this rare. What mythic did you get? Well, I'm looking at what commons did I get, because most of the pack is commons, and all of a sudden I have 5-7 playable cards. What can I do with this thing? And then I just find a way to trade. But my faff, so to speak, is the rares, the mythics. I bought a commander deck from Dragons of Tarkir, hoping I would get a Siege Rhino that I could build with. And I felt like I got ripped off because the whole thing's full of rares and I only have a couple of playable cards. So I'm like, I'm serious. I wanted to trade the whole thing back. And it's like, give me my $50 back, give me the...
Bemusedly as you try to explain to him what Siege Rhino is.
It's like, there's nothing I can play here. Who wants this, And so,
100%. And it opens up things like being able to foil out your entire deck. You can choose to get art cards. The aspect of deck building that may be a little bit more tedious elsewhere, like the land base, become a kind of a non-factor. Like, it lets you just appreciate the Magic product at large. And I think that's something that's just it. The fact that you can buy a deck next week, having built it a few days ago, and be like, push the boat out, just get myself another deck and actually play test it without it being a substantial financial investment or without having to proxy it, just makes it feel so much more dynamic and alive. I think it makes it feel so much more accessible and immediate than a lot of other formats.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, so if I'm a new player, right? So, and I have got a collection of bulk, right? It's a great way to employ that bulk and actually deploy it and have something that you can play with. But if I wanted an idea of commanders that are trending or things that are playable out there, I mean, where are some resources I could go to start even shopping and looking for ideas? That would be like my one thing I'd be curious about.
Sorry, repeat the question.
Yeah, so if I'm goldfishing, right? Because we're not on Goldfish. There's no MTG Goldfish affiliation yet. Where's a good place to go to look at deck lists that are existing, or if I wanted to see what commanders are trending, where's some resources that you could go?
Well, it's funny you ask, but nothing comes to mind, of course. No, of course. So we are both good friends of Clay, who runs cPDH.guide, which is one of the best resources available to learn about the competitive Pauper EDH meta. It has a lot of data on not only the winningest decks, but decks broken down by the tournaments that they played in, how many games they've played, etc., which archetypes they occupy, in addition to a collection of existing deck lists for those commanders, but also articles written about the game and feature content from various creators. It's an extremely polished and well put together resource that is constantly being added to.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and we love partnering with that group. The other thing too is I would say moxfield.com. It's the official. You know how they've got like Tapped Out, and they've got other places where you can start brewing decks. There's also Archidect. Mm-hmm. I know that you use Archidect quite a bit, Ben, and I love that interface. But the official one is going to be Moxfield. It's connected to Scryfall when you're trying to add and kind of play with these cards before you order them. So I would always check out moxfield.com if you're wanting to build up, if you don't want to go through the bin every time. I mean, though I love being able to go through that collection. I mean, there's something nostalgic about going through these cards and brainstorming.
And of course, if you want to get information or advice about deck brewing for the format, the absolute best place to come is to the cPDH.guide Discord. Likewise, we can point you at the Comic Connoisseurs Discord or the Sanctuary Discord and the PDH Homebase, amongst others. There's lots of different spaces for different levels of competitive play and different archetypes, different people's interest. The community is fantastic, and there will always essentially guaranteed to be someone who's willing to give you their time to learn more about the format.
Yeah, lots of good people in that group. That's why we spend a lot of our time there. You'll see us there as well. So
we'll be here most weekdays talking our lives away. So should we move on to talking about what we're going to talk about in this episode?
Yeah, let's jump in. So wanted to examine a couple of the commanders that have just really built names for themselves. Not necessarily in our format has a lot of really, really well-winned and well-proven combo, decks like Laid Lore. We've got Gretchen. We got some others, but we wanted to really highlight some of the others that have stood out and built a reputation without leaning on some of those combo lists. And the first one I wanted to talk about was Arabella, my girl, Arabella.
Arabella, the Abandoned Doll.
The Abandoned Doll.
Abandoned Doll, excuse me. This is a red and a white for a 1/3 legendary artifact creature toy. Whenever Arabella attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. So Arabella and the other commander we're going to talk about in this episode, Hollow Marauder, were both released in the last year. So Arabella was released in Duskmourn about 6 or 7 months ago, and Hollow Marauder was released almost exactly a year ago in Outlaws at Thunder Junction.
Yes, and Hollow Marauder specifically reads, so it's 6 and a black, and it is a Spectre Rogue creature that is a 4/2, and it actually has a cost reduction, which is part of why it's been so incredibly heinous. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature in your graveyard, so it has some graveyard synergies in it. It has flying as well as a 4/2, and this is the tricky part. When Hollow Marauder enters the battlefield, any number of target opponents each discard a card. For each of those cards, or each of those opponents who didn't discard a card with a mana value 4 or greater, draw a card. So they don't necessarily have to actually discard a card. They just didn't, right, for this draw trigger. So there's a lot of interesting components to that. So we should
to avoid you ending up drawing 3 cards of a Hollow Marauder cast. It's almost exceptionally unlikely. You will at least be getting 2 most of the time. But I think the reason Adam and I think these commanders are worth jumping into and talking about is that for the most part in our format, the most effective way to win games is through combo. And there are different ways of approaching that. You can attempt hybrid approaches that involve combat or pinger damage to some extent, where you're doing passive non-combat damage to opponents. You can set up stacks type pieces where you try to slow people or stall them. There are decks that want to win through combo very, very quickly and to basically mulligan very aggressively for that ideal opening hand. But outside of that, it is quite difficult for decks to penetrate that want to have what we'd probably describe more as a mid-range plan, where there's no one set of cards or set of actions you're looking to take to win. It's just a consistent value proposition across the course of the game. Both Arabella and Hollow Marauder have had not trivial success in the online space, at least since they've been released. So Arabella's top 4 at least one event, and Hollow Marauder's actually won 2 events. Which is sort of unprecedented for a mid-range deck. I don't know what you made of that, Adam, and what you think the significance of that is.
That is significant. I think that the fact that it does kind of thread the needle in a couple of ways. In some of the builds, I actually have I've piloted both decks in the past. I actually have a copy of Hollow Marauder now in paper, which Arabella is on the list. It'll be up there soon, but. It kind of runs a POC strategy, like if you're the old player, but I think closest to 8-rack is what would be probably the closest thing to it now, where you're just slowly taking down all of the opponent's resources and then just breaking that parity. And it's just a question of once you go through the stages of the game, the early game not so much, but it's kind of like a crescendo into that late game. It has how far ahead are you with everybody else, and so. We see that with Arabella too, though, because of its attack trigger. There's a lot of really interesting, like if you allow that attack trigger to hit, you see such a huge differential in life total between your opponents and yourself. Yeah. So
let's dive into Arabella a little bit more then. So let's talk weaknesses, options for brewing. Give me your first of all overall impression of the commander. What you would do to throw this together.
What I would do, what I've seen people do and what I would do are slightly different. I've seen, we talked about pingers, right? And I'll just define that really quick if people don't know. So pingers, in my mind, I think of, Tim's, like the Prodigal Sorcerer, tap, deal 1 damage type creature. This is actually triggered, deal 1 damage to all opponents. So we're looking at like Reckless Fireweaver. It's ETB triggers like Impact Tremors, right? And I've seen Arabella do the Heir Apparent builds where it's just kind of go wide and just overrun them, and the attack trigger from Arabella keeps you alive and keeps them dead. I've seen kind of the slow burn strategy where others have employed the pinger strategy. I would run a little bit of that, but I would also run some Reanimator with it, is what I would run, because white in this format, you get like Jolted Charge, you get Recommission, you get Return Triumph, you get a lot of these kind of unearth effects, which also happens to be the same mana cost of most of these pingers, right? So being able to have your kind of looting, reanimation, plus, if you wanted to really have the big stompies, your mountain cyclers like Oliphant and the Eagles of the North and some of these, there's Breath of Life, there's Late to Dinner, there's a lot of these reanimation cards in white.
True.
And so I could see that being an alternate kind of stompy, I would say long-term, if I don't know if there's such a thing as long-term slide, but I mean, like, you could almost come up with something like that in hybrid the two. That's what I would do with it. How about yourself? What would you do?
It's difficult. Arabella, it's worth thinking about the clock that the deck presents and what the deck's really trying to do and the comparison points it has in the format. So Arabella, in my mind, is like a turn 6 to turn 7 deck. If you look at how many bodies the deck can assemble on the board within that time frame, with X amount of card draw, etc., in my experience, on average, it looks to present lethal around turn 7. There are builds of Arabella that can present lethal before that with the right collection of cards, etc. It might well be possible to present a turn win around turn 5. It's tricky because Arabella typically, not always, but typically can't attack until turn 3. You can have turn 1 haste and labelers, you could use rituals, etc. Typically, you are going to get Arabella resolved by and doing stuff on turn 3, which means if you want to kill, for example, on turn 6, excluding damage from creatures or any other sources, Arabella needs to be dealing 7.5 damage a turn, turns 3, 4, 5, and 6. So, which is quite a lot, right? So it's more realistic, I think, to think of it in terms of being a turn 7 deck. And that, in our format, is actually not particularly quick. So Arabella attracts this kind of aggro label because the deck is built around attacking people and reducing life totals. And aggro, I think you'd probably agree, is slightly nebulously defined. But in my view, that's not really what Arabella is trying to do. If we look at existing established aggro decks, we've got Dago Kedis, Keleth Kedis, ECL Kedis, Heartfire Hero. These decks are on gut, I guess you could argue, although it slightly comes under the tempo label, but they're all trying, for the most part, to kill a single player at minimum by turn, let's say, between 4 and 6. Right, so you're now dealing with a smaller number of opponents, whereas Arabella, I think, struggles to kill anybody individually, but is very good at killing everybody symmetrically around the turn 7 mark. I think that the life gain is certainly an interesting and significant component of the commander, but I think it's more incidental, is my read. It helps in the aggro matchup, for example. It's very useful into the gut matchup. I think in general, having fewer components means fewer people to remove your stuff.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Which
I got
Arabella is one of the big weaknesses I think Arabella has, is that it's quite hard to build a list in a way that isn't very Arabella centric, which means that it's prone to kind of floundering and not doing very much if the commander is consistently removed. So you asked me what I would do with the deck. The variants of the brews I've seen are something like an all or nothing strategy, which plays a lot of the 0 mana creatures like the kobolds and the ornithopter, and aims to just put out as much damage as possible in the shortest possible time frame. A kind of toolbox strategy where the creatures you're playing are like cPDH and Simulacrum, where you can pay 4 and sack it to deal 4 damage to something. Benevolent Bodyguard to give Arabella protection. Maybe a Gold Hound, which can be sacked. It's a treasure token and it can be sacked for mana. Maybe even something spicy like a Stonehorn Dignitary, if you're particularly worried about the clapback. And those decks basically accept a slightly slower clock in exchange for having more variety in actions you can take. And I think the third build that I've seen at least once, but not very often, is kind of like 2-for-1 body strategy. So it's running cards like Raise the Alarm, Gather the Townsfolk, Hordling Outburst. So it's sacrificing some of those early creatures you play like on turn 1 or 2 in exchange for more slot compression. And sometimes those decks will run Wraths. Sometimes they'll, extreme, not the opposite of Wraths, pump spells. They might run more interaction. I think those decks attempt to play slightly more like control decks. That is probably where I would place my bet, because I think that Arabella's slightly slower clock for a quote-unquote aggro deck incentivizes it to play a little bit more interaction and a little bit more like a control deck. That would be where I would put my bet, but it is worth noting that the deck that made it to top 4 in Common Cause shortly after it was released was the toolbox strategy. It was running, again, the cards like cPDH and Simulacrum and Benevolent Bodyguard in an attempt to grind out opponents.
See, and I think that the toolbox strategy, to your point, is the most consistent way to not most consistent. Let me try that again, because consistency means that you're doing the same thing over and over with similar result. I would imagine, but I would say flexibility, right? So you have the ability to adapt to the pod around you. I mean, we don't have a sideboard in this format yet. I really am pushing for one, but because I mean, how cool would it be, right? But I mean, so if you're looking at what do I have in my toolbox? How can I fit this pod? Like if I got a control deck in seat 1, I've got an aggro deck in seat 2, mid-range in seat 3, and Arabella seat 4. First off, terrible, right? You don't want to be in seat 4 in that, but if that's the case, like what is my seat 4 strategy going to be the best? What's my build? With such a diverse pod, usually the flexible decks, right? And so totally agree with that sentiment.
I think it's worth touching on what Arabella's kind of niche is, and because it does, I think, offer something slightly unusual. We do have commanders that both do damage and gain life. Vizkopa Guildmage is probably the easiest comparison point. So Vizkopa Guildmage is a 2-mana Orzhov creature, where 1 white and 1 black for a 2/2, where you can play a white and a black to give target creature lifelink until end of turn. And then the same cost again, 1 a white and a black, so that whenever you gain life this turn, each opponent loses that much life. And that ability could be stacked. Yeah. So whenever you gain 3 life, if you stack the ability 3 times, each opponent would lose 9 life.
It's so deadly. So deadly.
Actually, according to cPDH.vibes, is one of the most successful commanders around, which I think is a reflection of some of the diverse types of metagame that exist geographically inside a format. Vizkopa in the online scene isn't actually seen very often. for a variety of reasons. But it's worth noting that the pace of that deck is radically different to Arabella. And Arabella does a lot more damage and gains a lot more life much more quickly, whereas Vizkopa is aiming to have big, explosive turns. Can you think of another analog for Arabella we have in the scene?
In my mind, probably the closest thing would be Gut Leader, but the reason I say that is because of like the color scheme, the reliance on the command zone, and just the overall go wide. Because Arabella needs to go wide, right, in order to maximize the effect.
Yeah.
And Gut Leader does that, but I actually got to pilot both Gut Leader and Arabella in Chicago, and. One of the truest pilots of both of those decks, Aggro Aaron, on the online meta, he's just fantastic in the aggro space, and he runs Boros a lot. And he had me try both of these decks, and I'll tell you what, I described this to him, that Gut is like driving a manual, like a stick shift. There's so many levers that you have to really components that you have to manually adjust for and do in a certain order. And Arabella really is more automatic, so it is a little bit more smoother when you're trying to go ahead. But it's also very focal pointed on the attack trigger, right? So. And so I would almost compare Arabella to any other attack trigger focused commander or command. Yeah.
I'd also make the comparison to, I guess, as we were having that conversation, I was thinking to other generic pinger commanders. So Gutter Snipe is one that people play around with in casual lists. More recently, Xiao Jun is another pinger commander that's, again, goes on the premise of playing a lot of permanents and extracting additional value from them. And then you get more niche stuff like, for example, Mischievous Chimera is a red, blue, and a red for a Chimera flyer that pings opponents when you cast spells in their turn. But there's nothing with quite the same amount of consistent damage output as Arabella, I feel, as early on as Arabella presents it.
I'm actually going to challenge that. I would say Lorehold Apprentice is a sleeper that does that. With the right piece of
same clock, dude.
See, all right, we'll talk about this at some point, and that's just fine. But I've seen Lorehold Apprentice come out of nowhere because some of those spirits have lifelink, and just it's kind of like if you put Arabella and Xiao Jun into a blender in this this big bloody mess.
Decent comparison, yeah. I mean, Lorehold Apprentice kind of come out of nowhere, and I think was kind of seen as, for those of you who don't know, Lorehold Apprentice is a white and a red for like a 2/2, I think, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, spirit creatures you control gain the ability to tap themselves to do 1 damage to each opponent, which doesn't sound like a lot initially. But essentially, most of the deck list ends up being the generic pinger creatures we mentioned that already do additional damage. And you then get access to all these spirits that can function as pingers in themselves, which means that by the time you've got 3 or 4, 5 or 6 of these creatures in play, each individual turn you're racking up huge amounts of damage, and it can be extremely explosive.
Especially when we look at the storm mechanic. So if you've got, because it's Magecraft, whenever you cast or copy, right? So that's the main thing. Yeah. So it's. But so I mean, you can see like a galvanic relay just going bananas with this, right? So, or a grape shot, of course, kind of the classic. But yeah. I mean, overall, Boros I think has seen a renaissance that it's needed for a long time in this format. White has a really unique identity. So it's really, really fun. If you haven't given Arabella a shot, definitely give her a whirl. She's great. She's a lot of fun.
So, do you want to move on to Marauder?
Yeah, we can talk about the Hall Marauder. Where to start? I mean, it
really is a unique commander. The closest thing we have in terms of like a black card draw engine is probably Morbid Opportunist. 2 and a black for I think a 2/3 that says whenever a creature dies, period, doesn't matter who it belongs to, you draw a card. This ability triggers once each turn. That's a maximum then of, unless you blink them or the Morbid Opportunist itself, of 4 times a turn cycle, which is honestly plenty, I would say, if you can manage to extract that. But no, Marauder is unique, no?
I think so, and it's unique because it's not Morbid Opportunist is a great. I mean, you can draw. I could see 5, sometimes 7 cards in a turn if you do it right. With like Village Rites or Deadly Dispute, you can really.
Sure, 100%.
Yeah. But what's interesting about Hall Marauder is that you're also having your Relentless not relentless rats. Excuse me. What's the name of it? The unearthed one. Rotting rats. You're having kind of that type of everybody discards a card
100%.
effect in tandem. So it's like having Siphon Mind on a body that costs 1 mana if you do it right.
100%. Yeah.
And being able to sack it, I've seen builds where they grave flicker it for so you can do multiple in a turn. You've also seen, and there's so many creatures that can cycle into the. Sorry, so many creatures that can cycle into the graveyard, or even mill strategies where you can fill the graveyard with creatures so quickly. And then black gets access to rituals like Songs of the Damned, where it's, a 1 mana instant mana source, if you're old enough to remember mana sources. Add 1 black mana for each creature in the yard, and all of a sudden, blam, you've got like this explosive out of nowhere turn. And and the one thing that I've seen Hollow Marauder do in kind of that attrition strategy where you're just trying to slowly ramp into the late game and play like this 8-rack kind of Pox control is that they'll run Opal Palace. And so with this cost reduction of Opal Palace, that's a land. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick, but it's Opal Palace, for those that you don't know what it does, hold on, stand by. It is a land that can tap for 1 colorless, or you can pay a colorless, tap it, and add 1 mana of any color of your commander's identity. If you spend this mana to cast your commander, it enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of times spent cast from the command zone. So if you're doing your 6th cast of Hollow Marauder with a full yard for 1 mana, right? You all of a sudden are playing a 10/8 with flying that you can just fly and beat people to death with.
I agree. I think this is like one of the best mid-range commanders it's possible to conceive of. Mono black is, arguably it could do with a second color. Most decks benefit from an additional color, but black, if you're going to be a single color, this is probably the best color to be in our format. Outside of some niche stuff like artifact and enchantment removal, black kind of just does everything. It gains life, draws cards, it makes mana, it finds unique ways to win the game, it bleeds people, destroys things, it has a smattering of pump spells if you really want them. And
it also tutors.
It does tutor, and Marauder just takes advantage of most of that very effectively. It's kind of surreal in a format that has been so mid-range, if you want to call it that, which is sort of the community term for decks that aren't anything else. They're not particularly fast. They're not necessarily comboing. They're not fast enough to be aggro specifically. They're not running enough control to be control, but they have some kind of value proposition they look to get online with the collection of permanents. This is kind of about as good as it gets, really. The train here is that you, as Adam said, you use mill creatures or cycling creatures to put enough creatures in the yard that you can play the Hollow Marauder very cheaply. You're drawing more cards, which are then more creatures you can put in the yard, in addition to some other value pieces, and presumably some way of getting the Marauder off the board. Get the Marauder off the board, it's now even cheaper than before, you play it again. And you consistently do so until your opponents have no cards, and you've got almost everything in your deck, either in the graveyard or in your hand. And so I think there's a reasonable question at this point, Adam, of why is this not... I'm probably asking the wrong person, but why do you think this isn't considered to be the best deck or one of the best decks in the format?
I kind of am the wrong person for that, but that's okay. Like I think that
Adam's a big Marauder stan.
I'm a huge fan of it just because the other thing that we really didn't talk about that black does really well that it's almost known for. We actually have a joke with one of our Clay that we mentioned. If he's not playing Simic or is it, he's running edicts, right? Running edicts, and what's nice about the edict effects, meaning that like Innocent Blood is a good example of an edict, right? So 1 mana sorcery in black from Odyssey, my alma mater, Odyssey. Yeah. So it means each player sacrifices a creature. So the sacrifice component of it is so deadly because it's not targeting a player, it's not targeting a creature. There's a lot of protection out there. It gets around it, and so. Yeah, threading the needle in that way, there's not enough graveyard hate slotted into most decks, though you can, and that's part of my argument for the sideboard again, is that, you know, if we had like something where you could, before the game, oh, I'm playing against Hollow Marauder, let me slide in some stuff, right? But without having more than, I would say, average 2-3 slots per 99 on average, that most people, I would assume, I mean, we can look at, you know, if we have stats on it, but there's not a lot of graveyard hate relative to other removal and interaction. So that's, I think, why it gets around it. But why is it not played? I mean, people play what they love, and as they should in this format, right? Not everybody loves mono black.
I think
But
so. I'll touch on
yeah.
because I think I'm a little bit more tepid on Hollow Marauder than you are. So I think I'm probably ought to make a few notes here. The big thing with Marauder is that mutual discard kind of tends to put your opponents in asymmetric positions. People who had an established board or had some established mechanism to get them close to the finish line tend to retain it, whereas people who hadn't got it online yet don't tend to acquire it at all. And one of the risks with playing Marauder is that some of the best decks we have in our format get established a lot faster than Marauder does. It's that expected to be presenting substantial threat, if not outright wins, by turn 5 onwards and often earlier. And it normally is the case that all players at the table make some effort to keep each other in balance. If you are emptying cards out of the hands of players who, for example, don't have a draw mechanism in the card zone, try that again, in the command zone, you can often put the player who has the established strongest position clear ahead of everybody else and make them somewhat unchallengeable. The best example of this, to avoid skirting around the bush, would be Weavers / Gretchen. So these are Simic green and blue decks in the format that are capable of very, very early wins, although also grind very effectively if they're dragged into the later turns of the game, which use land untappers, creatures that tap themselves to untap a land you control, in addition to auras that make those lands tap for more mana, to generate a lot of mana very quickly. And in both cases, the commanders have access to card draw on demand, which, as you can probably guess, means that if you're sitting down and the Marauder is beginning to do its thing, if the other two players who aren't playing either Weavers or Gretchen are gradually losing the hand, Gretchen is put in a much stronger position because when it goes for the combo, it's much less likely those people have the removal. So you put a lot of additional burden on yourself. It's also worth noting that Marauder does take a little time to set up. 7 mana, if they believe is what it costs, is not trivial, even with the additional cost reduction. And you do have a variety of responsibilities, I'd say, inside the list. You need to find a way to get creatures in the yard, sack the Marauder, and then ultimately do something to win the game. Adam's mentioned Opal Palace. It's honestly one of the few decks where that's actually a card worth talking about. But in this case, it really is genuinely worth thinking about. But you need to find something to do to kill people. You would occasionally hear people say, well, if no one's got a hand and I've got all the cards, I should be able to win. And it's like, oh, maybe. In most cases, yes, but not in all cases. And you do need to finish the game before it comes to a draw. And just to touch on the point about graveyard hate, you're correct. I mean, Marauder really takes advantage of the fact that most problems in our format can be solved with creature removal. And whilst graveyard hate is present, especially in a lot of combo decks to fight other combo decks, it is not necessarily modal enough or frankly just powerful enough in some sense for most decks to justify including a lot of it. So Marauder gets away with it. However, that does mean that Marauder is somewhat vulnerable to the state of the meta. If more people run decks that take access or make use of the graveyard, for example, Scholar of the Ages or Tatiova, etc., if those decks come back into the meta, it gets harder and harder for Marauder to function because people start bringing more graveyard hate. So it's not necessarily it's taking advantage of a particular snapshot of the meta, I would say. And that's maybe a reason it's been slightly more successful than we'd expect. With all of that said, Adam and I both touched on the strengths, but I'll make one final note that I think the big thing you can get away with Marauder is playing a lot more interaction than most decks can afford to do so, because you can expect to see a lot of your library. And Adam, I think your point about edicts was absolutely bang on. I hate edicts in general. I think that they're sloppy. They never do actually what you want them to do because people never sack the thing you want them to. And if you can't replace the creature or extract additional value from it, I think they're just I think they're just this kind of sloppy, lazy condition where you don't want to have to think about what you're doing. In this case, the fact that they make the commander cheaper and subsequently kind of facilitate drawing more cards is just beyond disgusting. And you can play very aggressively and very proactively at removing your opponent's stuff early, so that by the time you're able to get the Marauder online, it is less likely that people are able to acquire that win position. So my view is that Marauder right now is a little bit vulnerable to the state of the meta. And struggles a little bit to find a strong win condition outside of things like Crypt Rats and Pestilence, which it has to dig through the deck to acquire. But I do think this deck has a lot going for it.
Yeah, I think so too. And to your point, Sweepers really wrecks Arabella. And then and that's the one thing that I would look at too, is when we say Sweepers, we look at I mean, I think of the card Pyroclasm, but it's not legal in the format. Pyroclasm has only been an uncommon, but like you mentioned, Pestilence is such a powerful card, and it's one of my favorites too. It's absolutely one of my favorites. But Crypt Rats is right up there too, and Gangrous Zombies. I know that it runs that, and I think there's a couple of others that it has to, in a way, side in, because that is one of the weaknesses of. In my opinion, of Hollow Marauder, is that it just doesn't do well against token-wide aggro because of those edict components. And I can just get rid of a 1/1 token. Like if we're doing the Dragon Fodder Arabella strategy, right, where we've got raise the alarm. Oh, I'll just get rid of a soldier, right, and call it a day. Oh, I'll just get rid of this.
Commanders that are looking to leverage those tokens into very early aggression. Something like a Kadira.
Absolutely.
Kadira is definitely not in the meta in any sense, but I think it's worth saying that Marauder throws down bodies and it fills the yard, but it is principally trying to get stuff in the yard early, which means that there's not much of a defensive presence necessarily in the very earliest stages of the game. Which means that it can be vulnerable if it's not finding those control pieces to getting its head kicked in by a Dargo, etc. And because of how obnoxious it can be, the aggro player will often look at the Marauder player. Now, again, runs a lot of interaction, but it's something to consider. This is not a deck that starts doing stuff on turn 1. This is a deck that really becomes threatening probably around turn between 4 and 6, I would guess. I don't know what your view is on that, Adam.
No, I completely agree. Like you don't see much from Hollow Marauder really until, and conversely to Arabella, you don't see anything from Hollow Marauder really until the mid game like that. So when you're starting to see turn 4, turn 5, 6, and sometimes, but its late game presence is really, I mean, the only thing you see is you might see discard this, sacrifice that as you go, which that mid game disruption in negotiation in that space, I mean, is just so pivotal, and it's also nowhere near as, in my opinion, as noisy or as interesting. Flies under the radar in the early game, but Arabella, on the other hand, does a little bit of the opposite. I mean, it really seems to establish its board pretty quickly, which is to the detriment of Hollow Marauder, because if it's on the board, I can't discard it.
It's just funny, actually. I have no idea what the matchup looks like, but I would have said it was Marauder favored until I heard you speak about it. And actually, it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. I could see it going either way. So let's wrap this up. But let's talk in the closing moments about what do you think these commanders tell us about the meta, and what does it mean going forward for the design of cards, or for people looking in the database for commanders they think might be slightly underexplored? What do you think the success of these mid-range-ish, let's say mid-range-ish in the case of Arabella, commanders that have emerged in the last year means for the format, and means in terms of what could be successful?
The first thing that comes to mind is healthy and diverse. I mean, because we have a very diverse meta, and these decks are entirely different from one another. They both have winning performances that are noteworthy, and popularity because of that. Right now, I mean, we show mid-range to be the most popular brewing format, not necessarily the most successful, but most popular, according to some of the data we have from tournaments recently. But we see counterbalances to some of those fast combo decks in both of them. I mean, they employ completely different strategies, and it just tells me that these different strategies are indicative of really healthy diversity. And when I look at this stuff, I want to beat it. I want to break it. How can I defeat Hollow Marauder? How can I defeat Arabella? What can I brew to make better than or to defeat what's doing well.
So
And
as a
because
comment,
there's
what would you say if someone sits down across on the table from Hollow Marauder, which we both know you think is one of the certainly top 5 decks in the meta currently? What do you think? What would you suggest should be in that person's mind? Let's say they're not running an excessive or unusual amount of graveyard hate. How did they go about fighting the Marauder play?
Yeah, it's vulnerable in the early and its stages of the mid game, points in the mid game. I haven't seen Hollow Marauder employ a lot of life gain. There's some incidental. There might be a life linker or two, but so the more direct and the less wide the gaze is on both of these commanders, the more pressure you put on them. I think with Arabella's conversely, the way to beat her is actually with Voltron, with commander damage or even infect, or just deny her attack trigger. You really take the legs out from under her.
I think that's it. I mean, I think Arabella is actually significantly easier to play into. Not to say that it's an easy deck to beat, because Arabella can keep coming back and keep doing the thing, but it's quite hard for the permanents Arabella plays to close the games by themselves outside of using pump spells. And so if you are able to keep Arabella off the board, I think it's very difficult for her to close the game. She might catch a person, but to actually win it, it's tricky. I think Arabella thrives in very aggressive pods where her life gain gives her a slight edge, and the width of her board gives her an edge in chumping, some commander damage, etc. And just being able to take advantage of the additional damage in play. I think she struggles a little bit in more combo-centric pods, which are very insular and everyone's kind of doing their own thing. But to be blunt, that's true of literally almost every mid-range / tempo deck in the meta, right? It may not be true of strict aggro, but in the case of Marauder, it's interesting that it's kind of similar. I think Marauder does struggle into strict combo, but you've pointed out your view, it might struggle into strict aggro as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the one thing that Hollow Marauder has going for it that Arabella doesn't is that it denies resources in hand. So combo players often need to find and cast hold time. So they might even hold like an intervene to protect their combo. They might have like a Vines of Vastwood to protect the combo. Well, if you have to discard a card, is it my combo piece or my interaction? Sure. And so by removing that bit by bit, Hollow Marauder kind of gets an edge in a way. That conversely, though, you get rid of your opponent's ability to interact, right? So
it gets rid of opponents, period, a lot faster.
She absolutely does. But in the early game with Arabella, though, when I play a Voltron list mostly, Mystic Enforcer. But when I play that, and I see Arabella in the pod, I immediately say, "You are my best friend, Arabella. That's my girl. Let's go." Because you're going to take half of the life totals away before I start swinging. And that's the curse of Arabella, is that she can often be used for just knocking out half the life totals and then being knocked out herself.
I think that is the aggro challenge in the format at large, and it's one of the reasons that there's quite currently, if there is something that we need more pilots for and we need more representation for, it's aggro. It's a difficult format, difficult but essential component of any healthy space, I think. And,
I completely agree.
We have some fantastic options and not nearly enough pilots. So should we call that our end of our first episode? I think it's been an absolute blast and I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. My dogs, if you don't hear them in the background, they say the same thing. They are all set and ready to go. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and we definitely look forward to catching up with you again here at our partner podcast with cPDH.guide.
All right, I've been Ben, and this is Adam, and thanks for tuning in. Take care.
Cheers, everybody.